Bethany was not just any village, it was a refuge. Away from the bustle of Jerusalem, there was a home where fellowship was not an event, but a way of life. Martha, Mary, and Lazarus formed a family that understood the value of hospitality, and Jesus found more than just friends in them. He found rest. Imagine the scene, the smell of freshly baked bread, lively conversation around the table, and the presence of Christ himself sharing precious moments. They were not just hosts, they were confidants of the Master, witnesses to his deepest teachings. Martha was the tireless homemaker, always busy with the details, the kind of person who couldn't rest until everything was perfect. Mary, on the other hand, was the one who sat at Jesus' feet, absorbing every word. And Lazarus? He was the link between the two, a beloved and respected brother. Three distinct personalities, but one common faith. And here's a crucial point. This family not only welcomed Jesus into their home, but into their hearts. Their connection with him was not just physical proximity, but deep spiritual intimacy. Think about it. Many people know about Jesus, but few build a real relationship with him. Martha and Mary's home was different. It was a place where faith was a daily practice. If you had the chance to host Christ today, what would it be like? What would change in your routine? Would you treat him as a guest or as family? These questions make all the difference because the way we treat God reflects how we live out our faith. And Lazarus? Well, he was probably the one who kept the balance, the brother who helped Martha when the tasks were overwhelming, who encouraged Mary to keep seeking knowledge. But what no one imagined was that his story would take such an extraordinary turn. He was not just a friend of Jesus. He would become a living testimony to the Master's power. His name would forever be linked to one of the greatest miracles recorded in the Bible. Now imagine the trust this family had in Christ. They knew he had power, that he was different. But how far would that faith go? What would happen when their lives were shaken by the unexpected? After all, it's easy to believe when everything is going well, but what about when things spiral out of control? How do we react when God seems to delay? This brings us to a crucial moment in the story. Lazarus's illness and his sister's distress. And this is exactly where things start to intensify. What happens when desperation knocks on the door and Jesus hasn't arrived yet? Does he care? Is he listening? This was Martha and Mary's anguish, and that is precisely what we will discuss next. The illness came without warning. Lazarus, who was once full of life, now struggled to breathe. Martha and Mary watched their brother weaken before their eyes, and knowing that Jesus could change the situation, they sent an urgent message. Lord, the one you love is sick. Notice the choice of words. They didn't just say, Lazarus is sick, but emphasized that he was loved. There was intimacy here, a certainty that Jesus cared. But to their surprise, the response didn't come as expected. Time passed, and Jesus didn't arrive. Imagine the anguish. Every minute felt like another drop in the cup of despair. Martha kept looking at the road, expecting to see the Master's silhouette in the distance. Mary, perhaps holding on to hope, repeated to herself, "He will come, he will come." But then the worst happened. Lazarus didn't survive. Their beloved brother was gone, and with him their hopes for an immediate miracle. The house that was once filled with joy and fellowship was now filled with sorrow and mourning. And what did Jesus do? He stayed where he was for 2 more days. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? The Savior who healed from a distance, who walked on water, now seemed to delay on purpose. But God's delays are not denials. Often his silence tests our faith in ways we never expect. How many times have we cried out for immediate help, only to be met with silence? In those moments, our minds betray us. Did he hear us? Does he care? But there is something Martha and Mary didn't know. Jesus never acts without purpose. By the time Lazarus was finally buried, the pain became undeniable. 4 days of mourning. In Jewish culture, the 4th day was significant because it was believed that until then, the soul still lingered around the body. After that, hope was gone. In other words, to human eyes, the case was closed. It was over, or so it seemed. But what appears to be the end to men is merely a comma for God. Lazarus's death was not an accident or divine neglect. It was a stage being set for something much greater. Sometimes God allows us to hit rock bottom just to show that He can. Lift us up from places no one else can. But Martha and Mary couldn't see this yet. To them, Jesus was late. To them, He had been silent in the most crucial moment. And now, was it still worth believing? Was there any hope left after death? The answer to these questions wouldn't come immediately. First, they had to go through one of the greatest challenges of faith, the silence of God, because waiting can feel like a desert, but it's in the desert that we learn to trust. God's silence is one of the hardest tests of faith. When Martha and Mary saw Lazarus fall ill, their trust remained unshaken. They knew Jesus could heal him. But as time passed and nothing happened, uncertainty began to eat away at their hope. The message had been sent, but the response never came. The Master was taking too long. And let's be honest, waiting without understanding why is one of the toughest trials in life. How many times have we cried out for a miracle only to be met with silence? Mary, perhaps more sensitive, may have cried in silence, waiting for the miracle to happen at any moment. Martha, always practical, might have tried to keep things in order, taking care of funeral preparations while feeling a heavy burden in her heart. They had faith, but time was testing them cruelly. Each passing day was a new battle between hope and despair. Jesus' delay was not just testing their faith, it was revealing a powerful truth. God's silence never means abandonment, and this is where many people stumble. When God is silent, some give up, others complain, and only a few remain firm. Imagine a farmer planting a seed, and after a week without seeing sprouts, deciding to pull everything up because he believes nothing will grow. Many people do this. With faith, they wait a short time, and when they don't see immediate results, they give up. But Martha and Mary didn't. Yes, they felt pain and frustration, but they still believed. And that's the great lesson. Faith is not just believing when we see, it's continuing to believe when everything seems lost. Then, finally, news arrived. Jesus was coming. But too late? What could Martha and Mary expect now? There was nothing left to be done. At least that's what human logic said. Death had already won. Lazarus' body was already decomposing. If only Jesus had come earlier, everything would have been different. But now there was only mourning and memories. Maybe this is how many feel during moments of loss, as if God arrived too late. But here's the truth. Jesus is never late. He arrives at the exact time to teach the greatest lesson. Martha, even in her grief, still believed, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And in this simple statement lies the human heart before God. The pain of delay, the frustration of divine silence, but also the faith that somehow He could still do something. And it is at this moment, with broken hearts, that Martha and Mary finally meet Jesus. And what happens next would shake everyone to their core. What happens when the Almighty feels sorrow, when the Creator Himself sheds tears over human pain? This scene, which might seem like a small detail, is actually one of the most profound moments in the Bible. Jesus, standing before Lazarus's tomb, did not just observe the grief, He wept. Yes, the Son of God, who knew He was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, still felt the pain of the moment, and that teaches us something crucial. God is not indifferent to our suffering. These tears reveal a Christ who doesn't just perform miracles, but who deeply understands human fragility. He is not a distant, indifferent God. He feels, he cares. And that changes everything. Who among us hasn't faced grief so deep that it seemed unbearable? The loss of a loved one, a shattered dream, a mourning that no one else understands. In moments like these, Jesus' tears remind us that he is there, not as a distant spectator, but as someone who shares in our sorrow. Interestingly, this is the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, John 11:35. Just 2 words, but they carry an immense spiritual meaning. Here's something critical. He did not weep because of Lazarus's death. He knew Lazarus would soon be alive again. He wept because he saw the impact of death on humanity, the suffering it caused. This shows us that Jesus is not just the God of miracles, he is also the God of comfort. Sometimes, before performing a resurrection in our lives, he chooses to weep with us. And think about this. If God himself was not ashamed to show his emotions, why do so many people feel they must hide theirs? We live in a society that teaches us to suppress our feelings, to pretend we are strong when, in reality, we are breaking inside. But Jesus didn't do that. He wept openly. This teaches us that there is nothing wrong with feeling pain, with shedding tears. The difference is knowing that our tears are not the final chapter. After weeping, Jesus acted. He didn't remain stuck in grief. He took the next step. That teaches us something important. God feels our pain, but he also calls us to move beyond it. Mourning and grief have their place, but the story does not end in suffering. Christ himself teaches us that there is something beyond the tears, and that something beyond begins to take shape when Jesus stands up and does something that leaves everyone speechless. What he does next challenges everything that was known about death and defies human logic itself. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every eye was fixed on Jesus, waiting to see what he would do. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, and his body was already decomposing. To anyone present, this was a closed case. But Jesus doesn't see circumstances the way we do. He looked at the tomb and said something unexpected. "Take away the stone." A simple command, yet loaded with deep meaning. After all, if he had the power to raise the dead, why ask humans to move the stone? Here lies a powerful principle. God does the impossible, but he invites us to participate in the miracle. Jesus could have made the stone vanish in an instant, but he involved the people in the process. The same happens with us. There are moments when we expect God to do everything, but he calls us to remove the obstacles that block our miracle. This could be fear, resentment, or doubt. The first step toward experiencing a resurrection in any area of life is to be willing to remove the stone that blocks the way. When they finally removed the stone, an important detail was mentioned. "Lord, he already stinks." That meant, in human terms, there was no hope left. Lazarus's body was already in decomposition. And it is precisely in these moments, when everything seems lost, that God moves. If the Bible teaches us anything, it's that God is not intimidated by the impossible. He acts after death, when no one else can do anything. Then came the most extraordinary moment. Jesus, with absolute authority, said, "Lazarus, come out." Notice that he called Lazarus by name. Had he simply said, "Come out," all the dead might have risen, but he had a specific purpose. The same happens with us. God does not work in a generic way. He calls us by name, knows us intimately, and brings us back to life in a unique way. What happened next took everyone's breath away. Before their astonished eyes, Lazarus emerged from the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths. The man they had mourned was now a living testimony of God's power. But pay attention to one crucial detail. Jesus not only brought him back, he said, "Unbind him and let him go." In other words, resurrection was not just about coming back to life, but about living in freedom. Many people receive a miracle but remain bound to their past. God's true purpose is total liberation. And here's the issue. A miracle of this magnitude would not go unnoticed. It would spread across the region, awaken faith in many, but also provoke intense reactions among those who refuse to believe. Because when the light shines, darkness always tries to resist. The miracle of Lazarus' resurrection was not just an act of compassion, it was a prophetic message. Every detail of this event pointed to something much greater, Jesus' ultimate victory over death. If bringing a man back to life after 4 days was already astonishing, what could be said about the Son of God himself rising, not just for a time, but forever? What happened in Bethany was a preview of what was to come. Death has always been one of humanity's greatest fears. Since ancient times, people have sought to understand what happens after we die. Is it the end? A void with no return? The Bible teaches us that death does not have the final say. Jesus didn't just bring Lazarus back. He showed that death can be overcome. But there's a difference. Lazarus returned to life only to die again, while Jesus resurrected never to die again. His resurrection was the ultimate proof that eternity is real. Now stop and think. If Jesus has power over physical death, how much more over the deaths we face in life? How many dreams have we buried? How many hopes have we allowed to rot within us? Many people are alive but emotionally dead, spiritually paralyzed, trapped in invisible tombs. But the message of Lazarus is clear. If Jesus can call a dead man back to life, he can restore anything that has been destroyed. Another fascinating detail is time. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, which meant that to everyone it was too late. But God is not bound by time. Sometimes we think we've lost our chance, that it's too late for change. But for God, it's never too late. When he steps in, even the impossible obeys him. And yet, this miracle sealed Jesus' fate. After Lazarus' resurrection, the Pharisees made their final decision. Jesus had to die. Ironically, it was by his own death that eternal resurrection became possible for all. And this brings us to one of the most mysterious aspects of this story. Where was Lazarus' soul during those 4 days? The Bible remains silent on this, opening the door for various interpretations. Each of them raises deep questions about what truly happens after death. Not every miracle brings joy. For many, the resurrection of Lazarus was proof of Jesus' divine power, but for the Pharisees, it was a serious problem. They were already disturbed by his growing influence, but bringing a dead man back to life was simply too much. Before, they had tried to discredit him, but now their strategy had to change. They needed to eliminate him. And not only Jesus, but also Lazarus, because his very existence was undeniable proof of Christ's power. Fear was not spiritual, it was political. They feared losing their position of authority because people were beginning to see that Jesus was more than just a teacher. He was the Messiah. The resurrection of Lazarus was a turning point, something even their strongest opposition could not deny. But here's the truth. When someone refuses to accept reality, no amount of evidence will convince them. Pride and the desire for power blind the heart. But notice the irony. They wanted to kill Lazarus because he had been resurrected. Their reasoning was absurd, as if killing him again could erase the miracle. And this strategy hasn't changed throughout history. Even today, those who are living testimonies of God's power become targets of attack. Darkness always tries to silence the light. And here's an interesting detail. After this episode, Lazarus never speaks again in the Bible. We don't know what he did or said after returning to life. He simply disappears from the biblical narrative as if his purpose had already been fulfilled. But his presence alone remained a living testimony. This teaches us that sometimes The greatest impact is not in what we say, but in who we become after. This event, the Pharisees' decision to eliminate Jesus, became final. From this moment on, they began actively plotting his arrest and crucifixion. The high priest, Caiaphas, even unknowingly prophesied that it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. Little did he know that he was speaking a truth far greater than he realized. Jesus' death would not be a defeat, it would be the ultimate victory. And so, while the Pharisees conspired in secret, the people were left with a lingering question. Where had Lazarus been during those 4 days of death? No one could answer with certainty, and this mystery led to one of the most intriguing debates about life after death. This is one of the greatest mysteries of this story. What happened to Lazarus during the 4 days he was dead? Where did his soul go? The Bible remains silent on this, leaving room for various theological interpretations. Before raising him, Jesus told his disciples that Lazarus was asleep. This suggests that he was not conscious of time, much like someone who falls into a deep sleep and doesn't realize how long they've been out. But was this literal or just a metaphor? The first theological view argues that Lazarus was in a state of total unconsciousness. This idea is based on the belief that the dead remain in a sleep-like state until the final resurrection. It would be as if he had simply ceased to be aware of anything, only to wake up when Jesus called him. This would explain why Lazarus never shared any experiences of the afterlife, because he had not seen anything. On the other hand, some believe that Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom, a place of spiritual rest for the righteous before the resurrection. This belief is based on Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, not the same Lazarus from Bethany, where he describes a place of comfort for those who die in God's grace. If this view is correct, then Lazarus may have had a glimpse of eternity before being called back to life. Imagine being in a place of peace and suddenly hearing a powerful voice calling your name. But here's an intriguing detail. Lazarus never spoke about it. If he had witnessed something extraordinary, wouldn't he have shared it? His silence might indicate that his death was more like a deep sleep than a journey into the afterlife. Or perhaps he understood that his greatest testimony was not in describing what he saw, but in simply being alive again. Regardless of where he was, Lazarus's return to life had a greater purpose than just comforting Martha and Mary. God wanted to show the world that he has absolute power over death, and that it is not the end, but a transition. And just a few days later, another resurrection, one far greater, would take place, but this time it would be Jesus himself conquering death forever. Now, the real question is, if God has power over death, what does that mean for those who believe in him? What is the real hope for those who are in Christ? The answer to this question is the key to understanding eternity. Now that you understand this story in depth, the real question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Lazarus was physically resurrected, but what about your spiritual life? Are you truly alive or just existing? The Bible shows us that death is not the end, but one crucial detail remains. What comes next depends on what we do now. The story of Lazarus is not just an ancient account. It is a mirror reflecting our own faith. Jesus proved that he has power over death, but the real question is, do you believe it? If so, how is that belief shaping your life? What in your life needs to be resurrected? Your faith, your purpose, your relationship with God. If this content made an impact on you, share your thoughts in the comments. What stood out to you the most in this story? Had you ever considered these details before? Let's keep this conversation going. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more deep revelations about the Bible. After all, the truth sets us free, but only for those who are willing to know it.